Again, welcome. We're delighted to see so many people joining us as we engage in courageous conversations about race. This webinar will provide an introductory level of information on systemic racism and its historical impacts on people of color. In particular, people, Black and Brown people. We'll wrap up our session by providing tools to begin and hone our voyage towards becoming an anti-racist educator. A few logistics before we get started. This session is recorded and it will be used as a resource for members. Materials from this session, such as video links, will be made available on MSCA's webpage within 3 weeks. Due to the size of the group, we'll conduct the first segment of the webinar style with no audience audio participation. During this segment, we'll use prompts for you to reflect as you journal. We also encourage you to use the chat box. We will provide an opportunity for verbal discourse during the breakout segment of this session. These breakouts will not be recorded, or they may be recorded. You can ask your facilitator at that time. Be sure to take notes so that you can have record and use your journal because we have lots of information to share. I can't see who's on the screen because when you record, you have not the ability to see everything on the end. So I'm not sure if Cheryl's on the line yet.
She is here.
All right. Cheryl? And I think Beth is going to unmute you.
Should be able to unmute.
Okay. Beth had the power to mute me. Wow, that's great power.
And responsibility.
Great power because great responsibility, right? Welcome, everybody. And I just want to say the first prompt said, what do you see on the screen? Well, I see in our participants many friends, many leader activists, and eager people to take part in changing our schools for the better for all students, especially our Black and Brown students. So I thank you for participating. I want to thank Beth and Geraldine, if there were any other staff members involved in helping to put this together. I know I see Stephanie there. I just want to thank you for hosting this, for our educators. We have work to do to break down the institutional and structural racism that is in our education, in our classrooms. Not always intentional, but it's there. And we talk about implicit biases, but we also have structural barriers for too many of our students. So I unfortunately won't be able to join you this entire time. You may have heard that the governor's having a press conference. We don't expect any big announcement, but I need to pay attention to that because I'm already getting calls from reporters. But I can tell you my message is the same. Our health and safety is of the utmost importance and priority for educators, students, and families. But when we get virtual learning right, that means we have to do better for too many of our students who are unable to take part in education in the spring. And I know I can count on all of you to step up and to do that. We have lots of work to do in education to break down these barriers, and this is one of those first steps. So thank you for taking part in this. Thank you for having the courageous conversations, and please continue to be involved in this effort and many more that we do at the local, state, and national level. So have a great training, and thank you everyone who put this together.
Just to make sure that you had a chance, I'm going to go back because I couldn't see if anyone was able to access this. We're going to put it up for another 30 seconds. So if you didn't get a chance to participate in the chat box, there are 2 images. Please read the prompt and complete the task. And I think now we kind of see a little bit more responses. Perfect. Again, welcome to our training. To get started, I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Geraldine Duval. I'm an organizational specialist at MSCA. My primary role is to develop and provide professional development for educators and ESPs across the state. I love this part of my job because it allows me to refine our skills and to learn as a community. Another role is to monitor and review education policies and reform. I do this so I can provide resources to support you and your students. Today, I'm joined with a great group of colleagues with lots of expertise. I'm going to share their name and they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves when they get into breakout rooms. Joining us today, we have Joshua Davison, educator, Dr. Sandra Duval, educator, Celeste Harris, UniServe director, Danielle Jones, UniServe director, and Melanie Kozowski, educator, former MSCA staff. We have Carlos Malat, Kayla Moore, educator, Beth Ramey, UniServe director, and also organizational specialist, Stephanie Walters, should be UniServe director, Kiana Williams, educator. So let's get started. We have a few webinar logistics to make our time very effective. As you saw, we have muted your microphone, but please, you can still stay engaged. We will give you journal prompts to keep you engaged in this process. And we actually also use your reaction keys and the chat box to enter into the dialogue. To ensure we are efficient in the 90 minutes we have you tonight, I will review our net etiquettes. Please take some time to review the list. MSCA wants to create that community where we're learning together. Without a doubt, we will have different perspectives on issues, and that's okay. As time is limited, we'll be able to hear your voices, but not the voice of all participants. However, your engagement in the dialogue is essential, and it can be visible in other forms, such as the chat box or reaction key. You can contribute to the growth of the group by sharing ideas and resources. If an idea resonates with you, use the thumbs up button in the Zoom reaction tool. During the breakout segments, we want to be inclusive to as many voices as possible. But please limit your comments to allow multiple perspectives to fill the room. As I always tell my daughter, sharing is caring, so let's share the time. Remember, we are in this together, and we're here to learn as a community. We have 3 learning goals that we will accomplish this evening. The first, we will use tools to help strengthen how you talk about race. Goal 2, we'll build a common vocabulary so that we can help move the conversation about race forward. 3, you will begin to build a toolbox to know how to advocate for your students and their families and communities. Goal number 3, we will start today, and we will continue that goal in part 2. And more information will be shared later on about part 2. We just completed the welcome and introductions. To allow us to target our learning goals effectively, will you use this agenda? The first topic on the agenda is the 4 agreements. We'll provide an overview of Glenn Singleton's work, in particular, the 4 agreements and the compass of courageous conversations. I encourage you to take notes at this time. We will explore systemic racism and its impacts. We will also build a common vocabulary together. Following that foundational base of information shared, we'll provide a venue for you to dialogue during breakout sessions. This is where you'll have an opportunity to use your race conversation tools. We'll wrap up our session by providing you time to reflect on how to become or how to hone yourself in becoming an anti-racist educator. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joshua Davison.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for coming and joining us for this very important work. I'm going to go over the 4 agreements of courageous conversations about race. As Geraldine said, this is from the work of Glenn Singleton. So when we engage in our courageous conversations, we want to make sure that we stay engaged. We're very distracted as a people in general. And so it's important that because of the nature of the discussions that we're going to have, that we do stay engaged. We have to realize that as we're engaging in these courageous conversations, that we may experience some discomfort. We may decide that there's something that we didn't know existed, or we didn't realize was the case, and we may feel discomfort about the things that we're discussing. We have to realize that in order to engage in a true courageous conversation, that we have to speak our truth and be honest with everyone in the room. And at the end, we're not going to have every answer. We're not going to be able to definitively say, aha, this is how we're going to solve the problem completely. So we're going to expect and accept that there's probably going to be non-closure, even at the end of our conversations this evening. Can someone go to the next slide? So this is called the Courageous Conversations Compass. It's also from the work of Glenn Singleton. And as we engage in our courageous conversations, we're usually in one of these areas of the compass. So we may be in our emotional phase where we're responding through our feelings. When a racial issue strikes us at a physical level and causes an internal sensation such as anger, sadness, joy, or maybe even embarrassment. We may be in our intellectual phase. Our primary response to a racial issue or information may be characterized by personal discomfort, disconnect with the subject, or a steadfast search for more information or data. Our intellectual response is often verbal and based in our thinking. We may be in the moral phase of our compass. We respond from a deep-seated belief that relates to the racial information or event. The belief has to do with the rightness or wrongness of a given racial issue. The justifications of one's moral views are often situated in the gut and may not be verbally articulated. We may be in our relationally, we connect and respond to racial information through acting, or what is most often characterized as specific behaviors and actions. So when you look at this compass, sometimes you may be in one area of the compass during a certain period of the conversation, but maybe you automatically jump to another part. So you may be thinking about, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And you're in your thinking or intellectual area of the compass. And that's going to jump you automatically to the doing or the acting portion of the compass. So as we have our courageous conversations, part of us being engaged and part of us being honest with the conversation is talking a little bit about and grounding ourselves in, where am I on this compass as we go through these discussions?
Thank you, Josh. So again, this is very important. As we go through the rest of this presentation, we want you to really think about how are you approaching the topic that's being given to you? Are you approaching it from the moral cardinal direction, the emotional direction, the intellectual, or the social? So keep that in mind and write some notes in your journal. Let's look at this quote. Give you a few minutes to look at it. In a society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Those are powerful words. And these are the words that we're using to help us frame our work today. When we think about anti-racist, it is defined as the ability to focus and sustain action to make change in the system, to change institutional policies, practices, and procedures. So I want you to keep in mind that, and let's look at this video clip.
So I have a question for you. Are you non or are you anti? Several months ago, in response to Ferguson, Baltimore, the killings of Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice, my friend Caitlin put up a Facebook post breaking down the difference between non-racism and anti-racism. Most of us are non-racist. Because racism is looked upon as some moral lapse, we feel quite self-assured by simply not being racist. I'm not a bigot. I don't sing that N-word when my favorite rap jam comes on. I didn't vote for that guy. I'm not burning any crosses. I'm not a skinhead. I don't, I won't, I'm not, I've never, I can't. What you end up with is an entire moral stance, an entire code for living your life and dealing with all the injustice in the world by not doing a damn thing. That's the great thing about none. You can pull it off by simply rolling over in your bed and going to sleep. So why are you sitting at home and watching things unfold on TV instead of doing something about it? Because you're a non-racist, not an anti-racist. Now do this for me. Take the C out of racist and replace it with a P. I'm not a rapist. I'm not friends with any rapist. I didn't buy that rapist last album. All these things that you're not doing. Meanwhile, people are still getting raped and black boys are being killed. It's not enough that you don't do these things. You're going to bed with a clear conscience is not going to stop college students from getting assaulted. You thinking climate change is terrible is not going to stop climate change. You being so assured that you're not anti-black, anti-Muslim won't stop the next hate crime. And it's wonderful that you recognize how brave gay people are when facing persecution, but they aren't the ones who need to be brave. We need to get active. We need to hold people accountable. We need to accept that what hurts one of us hurts all of us. And we need to stop thinking that injustice going on in the world isn't to an extent our fault. We need to stop being non and start being anti.
Racism is a business. For centuries, it has underpinned global economic.
So let's take a moment to process that. What does being anti-racist mean to you? Reflect back on Glenn Singleton's compass and think about what cardinal direction was the speaker coming from? How was he engaging you in the conversation about race? It's the teacher in me. I'm giving that wait time. So let's take a look at that. So in the video, he approached the conversation about race using 3 cardinals primarily. He approached it in the moral when he said, I am not, I don't, I never, I won't, I can't. Moral stands for living your life. He approached us in the emotional direction when he stated, while you were sleeping, people are still getting killed. Black boys are being killed. But the way he chose to engage us with the most passion was using the social cardinal direction, the social point. He urged us to take action, to change policies, and to make a difference. Take a minute to process that. We will begin to delve into the action in this series, part 1, but we will continue that work in part 2 of how to be an anti-racist educator. But let's dig a little deeper into the definition of racism. The graphic in front of you offers another way to understanding racism. There are 2 main levels in which racism occurs. One is the individual's level. In the graphic before you, it's the blue section on the bottom half of the circle. And 2, the systems level, which is on the top half of the circle of the graphic. How do we define each? So let's go. We have internalized, again, interpersonal. They fall in the individual's level. Institutional and structural fall in the systems. Let's go backwards and take them one at a time. Internalized racism. We define it as what lies within us, individuals. These are your private beliefs, the biases you may have about a race, and how you are influenced by your culture to form these biases. When we think about racial prejudice, it is racial prejudice towards people of different races. When we think about oppression, it is having internalized oppression that your belief about yourself is negative, and usually beliefs about oneself by people of color. When we think about privilege, it is internalized privilege, the entitlement of white people. Again, individual self. So let's take a look at an example together. Some of you guys may be familiar with the doll test. In 1940s, a psychologist, it was a husband and wife team, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, they designed and conducted a series of experiments. These experiments were known as the doll test. They were used to study the psychological effects of segregation on African-American children. The Clarks used 4 dolls. And within the test, they had the subjects, which were children ages 3 to 7, identify both the race of the doll and which doll they preferred. A majority of the students, in this case the children, preferred white dolls. And not only that, they assigned positive characteristics to these dolls. Hence, Clark concluded that prejudice and discrimination and segregation created a feeling of inferiority among African American children. It damaged their self-esteem. Again, this is internalized racism. Again, a feeling of self. If you are unfamiliar with the doll test, this was a big study. It was that study that sparked and created changes for segregation in schools. It was that made changes into what we know now as Brown versus Board of Education. The study helped Supreme Court justices understand that lingering effects of segregation was affecting children, and they needed to put a stop to segregation of schools. So a little bit about internalized racism. Moving to the second part of individuals, which is interpersonal, still at the individual level, but involves others. So we classify that as biases that occur when you interact with other people about your private beliefs, but in public interactions. This may be in form of slurs, biases, hurtful words or actions. In most cases, it may be a joke amongst people, a racist joke in that sense, where the party in effect hears that and they take it in, individual. It may be that you hear a comment, a negative comment about a race being shared at the staff lounge. Again, interpersonal level of racism. What we must understand is the US cultural narrative usually talks about race and focuses it on the individual level, the individual racism. Hardly do they talk about it in the system level. My screen just went black, hold on. Okay. There we go. Can you guys still see? Hopefully.
Yep, it's good on our end.
Okay. The storms are interesting. So we must understand that this construct of us looking at it in the individual level has always been a reality. So how do we move to change? We must look at it in the systemic level. Institutional racism. Institutional racism is defined as when it involves institutions. When institutions have unfair practices and discriminatory practices, in examples of institutions such as a school, healthcare, housing, those are institutions where they produce inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. So let's look at it in our own structure of school. This may exhibit itself where you see a school system where students of color are predominantly in overcrowded classrooms or in underfunded schools, or you may simply observe where it's very apparent that children of color are underrepresented in AP classes and overrepresented in special education programs, an effect of institutional racism. Then we move to structural. Structural has an underlying pinning of institutional racism. It is when biases occur among institutions, but across society. It involves a cumulative and compounding effect of the interactions of the institutions and the policies that are systemically providing privilege to white people and disadvantages to people of color. Let's take a look at an example that you may be familiar with, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. At this time, I've already shared 3 different levels of racism. If you want to, you can also join the chat and share other examples that may fall into each of the ones I've shared. As we continue, structural racism was part of that Tuskegee study. If you were unaware, in the 1930s, all the way to 1972, I believe, there was a study conducted on African-American males. They were told they were going to receive free health care from the federal government, another institution. They had syphilis, but they were never informed of their diagnosis. Despite knowing, they risked infecting others because they were unknown of their risk factors. And we knew the disease could cause blindness, deafness, mental illness. But yet, the men who had syphilis were never told of their diagnosis. Again, the institution is the healthcare system. Where it becomes structural is when it compounds. These families were impacted for centuries. So not centuries, but years, and maybe centuries in some cases. They were affected in economic power within those families. If you understand this closely, in 1947, penicillin became a standard treatment for syphilis. But researchers decided to continue to observe these men and intentionally withdrew the antibiotic treatments. So they were provided no care, and many of them went blind, insane, and suffered severe complications. The part that's compounded is over 28 men were shown to have developed syphilis, and over 100 more actually developed complications from it. Maybe about 40 spouses or so contracted the disease during that time, and 19 children were born with the disease, affected families for generation. That affected their economic structure, that affected their ability to work and be in areas of good housing, again, touching into multiple institutions. So we just share a few examples, and hopefully you added some to the chat box to continue our dialogue. And you may want to share cases that are more personal to you. So let's look at this in a video that kind of summarizes it all.
Moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk about it all wrong. But have you ever tried to quantify exactly how and why the media gets it wrong about race and what we can do to fix it? Well, there's a new paper published by Race Forward entitled Moving the Race Conversation Forward that sets out to do just that by compiling nearly 1,200 articles from major newspapers and cable news outlets and systematically breaking down the most common mistakes we fall into when we talk about race. And in their research, Race Forward identified 7 harmful practices, the 7 most common bad habits in media coverage of race, as well as recommended strategies to get us back on track. And I recommend reading all 7 for yourself, but right now I want to focus on just one of the biggest traps that racial justice conversations fall into, which is our tendency to focus too much on individuals instead of systems. Because when we talk about race, when we talk about racism, when we talk about racial justice, it's important to remember that there are levels to this thing. There are at least 4 different levels of racism that each need to be considered. The first level is internalized racism, which is all the prejudice, bias, and blind spots you might have within yourself as an individual. The next level after that is interpersonal racism, which is what happens when we act out that internalized racism on each other. Those 2 levels, the internalized and the interpersonal, are the 2 individual levels of racism. And those are the simplest ones to focus on, the easiest to recognize in our day-to-day lives, the ones we spend most of our time talking about, but I'm here to tell you, there's something else: systemic racism. Once you get past those individual levels, first of all, you have to deal with moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk about it all wrong. But have you ever tried to quantify exactly how and why the media gets it wrong about race and what we can do to fix it? Well, there's a new paper published by Race Forward entitled Moving the Race Conversation Forward that sets out to do just that by compiling nearly 1,200 articles from major newspapers and cable news outlets and systematically breaking down the most common mistakes we fall into when we talk about race. And in their research, Race Forward identified 7 harmful practices, the 7 most common bad habits in media coverage of race, as well as recommended strategies to get us back on track. And I recommend reading all 7 for yourself, but right now I want to focus on just one of the biggest traps that racial justice conversations fall into, which is our tendency to focus too much on individuals instead of systems. Because when we talk about race, when we talk about racism, when we talk about racial justice, it's important to remember that there are levels to this thing. There are at least 4 different levels of racism that each need to be considered. The first level is internalized racism, which is all the prejudice, bias, and blind spots you might have within yourself as an individual. The next level after that is interpersonal racism, which is what happens when we act out that internalized racism on each other. Those 2 levels, the internalized and the interpersonal, are the 2 individual levels of racism. And those are the simplest ones to focus on, the easiest to recognize in our day-to-day lives, the ones we spend most of our time talking about, but I'm here to tell you, there's something else: systemic racism. Once you get past those individual levels, first of all, you have to deal with institutional racism, the racist policies and discriminatory practices in schools and workplaces and government agencies that routinely produce unjust outcomes for people of color. And when you step beyond that level, you have structural racism, the unjust, racist patterns and practices that play out across the institutions that make up our society. The individual and systemic levels of racism are both important, both necessary to reckon with, and they're both usually interrelated. But if you want a real, fully clear-sighted conversation on racial justice, you have to be talking about both levels. And one of the most common ways we fail to see the big picture on race is by failing to think about systemic racism, by failing to be systemically aware. In their research, Race Forward found that our media coverage far too often falls into that trap. They found that approximately 2/3 of race-focused media coverage fails to consider how systemic racism factors into the story. 2/3 of their coverage of race fails to be systemically aware. And that is a problem. When we constantly focus only on individual stories, it distorts our sense of how racism works. It encourages us to see racism only as the product of overt, intentional racist acts by individuals that can be fixed simply by shaming and correcting those individual defects. And it encourages us to see individual stories of transcending racism as proof that there is no more racism. That if we have a black president and Oprah is a billionaire, then there must not be anything else to talk about. And any problems that other people of color still face must be due to deficiencies on their part. It must be a problem with them instead of a problem with the system. And that is no, just no. We cannot have a real, thorough conversation about incarceration rates for people of color, about the thousands of families torn apart by our immigration policies, about the perennial disparities in education, housing, healthcare, employment opportunities. We cannot have real talk about any of the biggest issues that affect us all as individuals if we are not also thinking about the systems involved. We cannot have a discourse that brings us closer to racial justice without being systemically aware.
Okay, so take a minute to write down any thoughts that come with that. I'm going to stop my share screen and see if we can figure out what's the scrambling. Okay, when you came in, we saw that we had multiple perspectives. Some people saw that image and they saw a bird or a lady, and some people saw a cube with six cubes, or if you saw 7 cubes. I want to tell you that everyone's right, because basically what you saw, you believe as the reality. Those are your perceptions, and they form our basis and our judgment. And that begins implicit biases, because it's based on what we see and we believe and see, and so we understand it to be reality. You have a list of inventions. Some of you guys may be familiar with these inventions. In particular, the one I want to address is the blood plasma by Charles Drew. If you're unfamiliar with this, this was a research done by Charles Drew, who again was a fellow from Columbia University, and during the time there, he developed a procedure for processing and preserving blood plasma. This is a research that we're currently using now for people who are trying to diagnose vaccines for COVID-19. All these inventions, if you are unaware, were by African-American inventors. What's powerful about this is, how do we change the narratives about race? How do we provide positive stories so students can see themselves? So we remove the priming and the assumptions that are made. How do we distract from the policies and practices from these structural racism that we talked about? You'll delve into some of them a little later, like residential segregation and the FHA loans, and how all those implicit biases feeds into the structural racism. This timeline is not comprehensive of our history, but you'll find some particular highlights. We talked about the doll test. If you look at the Emmett Smith tip, this was one of the first riots that created and sparked the civil rights movement. And it was because Emmett Till was visiting his relatives in Mississippi, and he was accused of addressing a white woman incorrectly, and that led to his death in lynching. So again, some of these things have sparked a lot of movement, but they're all based on policies. Policies and procedures is what creates this systemic racism. You may ask yourself, this list is very familiar. It's part of our day-to-day norm that we see the issues of people protesting against violence to Black Americans, African Americans. Some of these cases are very important, or you may have more familiarity with them. Trayvon Martin, the young boy who was in Florida, who was killed by a community officer because he looked suspicious. You may know Freddie Gray. What's interesting about Freddie Gray is one of the few last words he said was, "I can't breathe." Again, this is more of a local case that occurred in Baltimore. When he was transported, something occurred during his transport and he was in a coma, but it was told that he had injuries sustained from the police, but the police were acquitted during that. And more recently, the George Floyd. These are a lot of deaths, but what's more interesting is if you look at this list, which is also not comprehensive, because this list does not include the case we just talked about, Freddie Gray, right in our backyard, Baltimore, you see a lot more names. It stems from the case of Eric Garner in 2014 all the way to George Floyd. Lots of deaths. So when they say Black Lives Matters, it's because the rate of death to African American exceeds those of whites. Research that was done in 2018 showed that about 23% of deaths tied to police brutality were Blacks, even though they comprised 12% of the population. Another study done by Stanford University showed that in the period of 2011 to 2017, 100 million traffic stops were made for racial profiling, and most of them were pulled over because they were Black drivers, not white drivers. So what we're going to do is do a quick analysis, and in your journal, I want you to jot down 12, but we're going to do only 6 so that we can maximize our time. And we're going to do the first 6 questions. You'll have access to the other 6, so you can do that on your own time. So what you will do is number your paper from 1 through 6. If you believe the statement is mostly true, you'll put a 5. If you believe it's sometimes true, you put a 3. And seldom, you put a 0. First statement is on your screen, and I'll read it out loud to help those who are both auditory and visual. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. So you'll put a 5, 3, or 0. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. Again, this is the quickest response. So the first thing you can think of, not to spend a lot of time, a 5, 3, and 0. You get a more authentic response. 3, I can go shopping alone most of the time and be pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. 4, when I'm told about national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. 5, I can be sure that my children have been given curricular materials that testify their existence and their race. 6, I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. 7, whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against me and the appearance of my financial reliability. 8, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. 9, I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. 10, I can remain oblivious of the language and customs of the persons of people who constitute the world's majority without feeling in my culture any penalty for such oblivion. 11, if a traffic cop pulls me over or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. And 12, I can easily buy posters, postcards, pictures books, greeting cards, dolls, toys, and children's magazine featuring people of my race. If you can do a quick tally of your total sum for the survey, it would look similar to that. What I would like you to do is put your race and your score in the chat box. And some people may be still processing, so we're going to let people enter the information in the chat box and continue. So when you look at this, again, you must realize this is a survey on privilege. Here's a quote from the researcher herself. I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance in my group. I'm seeing the chat box go in, and with a quick glance, I'm waiting for a couple more to pop in. You probably will notice that many of the people of color, Blacks, Browns, Asians, also may fall closer to a smaller number in their results, while the whites have a higher number, again showing a presence of white privilege. I thank you those who are brave enough to put the information, because we are a learning community, and by doing this we can learn from each other to see the importance of this. So why is it important? Well, Peggy did this research because she wanted to make sure that people understood the power of privilege and how privilege, again, fits into the discussions about power, gender, and race in the United States. If we look more closely, this issue is also seen in our current state. In the midst of the pandemic, people might be noticing that the media is saying that we have seen more people of color who have contracted COVID. You may ask yourself why. Here's an example of a why. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York did a survey, and they realized their bus and subway workers were being hit heavily by Corona. They had experienced 41 deaths, and over 6,000 of them had been diagnosed with COVID-19. This was a 2018, in April, the survey was done. But what you must realize is the people who worked at the MTA were mainly Black and Latinos. They weren't afforded the opportunity to work from home, so they were exposed to the virus. So Black people are more likely to be represented in the high numbers because they are the essential workers. They are the essential workers that are out there helping us because they service in us. In some cases, they are more likely also members who work in the healthcare industries, in the hospitals, where again, patients of COVID are there. So all these are stemming to show the power of privilege. Video from Molly Diaz.
Charlie Dias. I'm 11 years old. A lot of grown-ups think that opportunities exist for all kids and all we need to do is apply ourselves. But I know that's just not true. It shouldn't matter if you live in the city or suburbs, on a farm or a reservation, or what your zip code may be, but it does. There's still rules to keep our schools separate and unequal. Why? We spend a lot of time talking about whether what someone says or does is racist, but that's not enough. You not liking me for the color of my skin is not the only thing that can affect my chances for success. I'm talking about the built-in barriers that keep me and other kids from reaching our full potential. It's all around us. We might not recognize it, even when it's right under our noses. Like, remember that time I had to start a campaign just to get books in my library about kids who look like me? Do you care enough to look closer, to talk to each other, to your students, to your communities? We've got to change the dialogue, because when we do, you'll be amazed by all we can accomplish. I'm looking at you.
This video was created because it was sparked by a student. And this is powerful because Molly Diaz was a student, and in November 2015, she decided she didn't want things to remain the same. So she launched a campaign called 1,000 Black Girls. A little bit about Marley. Marley was named after a reggae singer, Bob Marley. Everyone loves that singer. Great song. And Marley is of Jamaican and Cape Verdean descent. Again, she decided that she wanted to do a change in what she saw. So she complained to her mother that all the mandatory readings that she had in her books were of white boys and dogs. And that was not a good thing. She wanted to change. So she decided to do this campaign to change the narrative. And when she did the campaign, they were able to get over 9,000, 9,000 books, because she wanted to see herself and wanted others to see Black females as the protagonists. This is taking change and making action. So using that social lens that Glenn talked about. So when you go on and process in your journal, think about ways that you can impact changes. Again, this was a change that changed how we looked, and now we have several organizations that have inspired, and MSCA has partnered, and we'll share that resource later on, how to find resources where students look like themselves. They see themselves in the curriculum. The next couple of slides you're going to see is going to be data on systemic racism. These slides will approach the conversation about race in the intellectual realm. So let's take a look at that. Systemic racism. It can lead to issues of discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, and political power. Look at the data. The data tells it all. So understanding is our first step. You will now be sent into groups, and I'm going to explain what you're going to be doing. We were able to share some of the ways that you can conversate in these groups by using Glenn Singleton's 4 agreements. We also want you to concentrate on which cardinal direction of compass that the data that's going to be shared with you is coming from ahead, but that's the power of the great conversation that's taking place in our community. So I'm going to allow folks who looked at the systemic racism, group 1 and 6, to do a quick report out.
So I'll just report for my group. I forgot to assign anyone, so I don't want to put anyone on the spot. But we just talked about how the importance of community and engaging parents. I'm gonna jump all over too. And engaging parents, so it's not this is at school thing, this is a at home thing, but it's a whole community aspect when we're talking about addressing issues in our community. And then we also talked about the importance of having conversations and being transparent, so that we are also able to address our biases and do a lot of self-reflection. We also talked about tests that can actually tell you where you are with your biases. And we talked about a lot of things that we can do to just get engaged, because our students, especially as educators, they want to see us out there. So what we can do as far as that.
Thanks, Kiana. Any other edits from group 106 to share out?
And just, we looked at the systemic racism one as well. And we didn't get to the third question because we spent a lot of time on 1 and 2. But the folks in our breakout session really talked about being honest about the biases that they have, right? Like we all have, and being a reflective educator. When we think about, why is it that, Jamal, for example, doesn't have the necessary supplies? Why is that? And why do I expect him to have those? What is it about my culture that makes me expect that? And that we're not race blind. And there was a question about being afraid to sort of start these conversations for fear of messing it up. And then there was a lot of agreement that there really isn't a way to do that. If you're coming with an honest, desire to engage, we're going to give honest response, and the honest response is not, we don't want to hear, because that will break things down.
Thank you. Any group 2, Beth?
Awesome. I, like Kiana, did not assign a share out person, so nailing that facilitation. I think my group really was like, yeah, but like action, because this is really important, and I'm here with you on that. A lot of folks talked about different podcasts, media, like really digging in and learning, joining book clubs. We also talked about then, like in each of our roles, like what does that look like? So a school counselor talked about discipline. How do we dig in on discipline and rewrite? How do we, discipline students? How do we make sure we're not just sending students out of the class to administrators as quickly as possible? How do we have tough conversations, do examinations of our curriculum, and change that curriculum? And then really, how do we kind of scale up to systems? We had Carla share about community schools from Prince George's. So there was a lot of good talk about systems, and restorative practices, thank you, was a big part of our conversation as well.
Thank you, Beth. Group 3.
Hello, so we looked at the school to prison pipeline, and what our group pretty much talked about was, one, for some people, We had a principal who shared, and she said that they just had more SROs put into their elementary schools, and they thought it was a great thing. And now it gave her a new way of thinking how police relationships are just with the community and what that can mean for schools now. So that was something that really stood out to me. We discussed how important it is for teachers to advocate for students and make sure that you show fairness in classrooms, especially when it comes on to calling students and how you're talking to them. And lastly, we talked about, again, it was more so advocating, again, making sure you're aware of how students are being suspended, making sure you're not that teacher pushing for those things, and making sure that you have culturally relevant curriculum.
Thank you, Kayla. And group 5, is it 5? Are we up to 5?
I think it's 4.
4, sorry, Danielle. Group 4,
But
Danielle.
I don't know, you guys just been treating me some type of way today. It's okay. Anyway, so I'm just like the rest of us. We got involved in the conversation and didn't get a chance to assign anybody, but we talked about redlining and the effects of redlining on you know, just on the Black and brown community, and just some of the privileges and things that are given versus that are not given. We talked about, so how, there was a question in the room, well, what could we do? So I spoke from the aspect of contacting your local legislator, you know, being on some of the teams within the community. And then, you know, basically, if you see something is wrong, then say something about it, do something about it. In addition, one of, and I can't remember her name, I believe she was from Dorchester, but if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But she was talking about the importance of recognizing redlining doesn't just affect homeowners. It affects those that live in apartment complexes because they're not often considered when it comes to the redlining. And a lot of the funding and things are funneled different places where it should be funneled and provided, you know, for those areas. So that was something that was brought up. And the last important point that was brought up was how redlining affects the children, because the parents may be working 2 or 3 jobs to make sure that they can support their family. And if you have a child that's coming into school, recognizing and learning the environment that you're in. There were 2 young ladies that spoke to, if you need to be present in your environment, be a part of the system. Don't be outside of the system looking in. And, you know, just watching. She was like, you have to get involved. You have to be a part of the system. Because in doing so, then you'll know why that child is coming to your classroom and they may not have food, or you may know why that child may be homeless and you didn't know because you were standing outside the circle before, but at least now you know what's going on. So they had some very good ideas. We wish we had more time, but yeah, it was some very good ideas and conversation that took place.
Thank you, Danielle. And now to group 5.
Hi. We had a short video on microaggressions, and some of the discussion was around the fact that microaggressions really aren't micro at all. It may be a good introduction to those. It may, if someone said this video may be an entry point for some people who had never thought about things that they think are compliments. You know, the classic, oh, you're so well spoken, or something along those lines. And several people said those compliments drive me up a wall. Asking if they can touch my hair just sends me. For some folks, though, saying that it's a microaggression almost minimizes it. And there was discussion around that. Someone came on and said that on their staff, they are talking about if you're not sure about something that you're about to say, before you say it, think what makes you say that and what makes you think that. before it actually comes out of your mouth. And they said that's sort of a mantra that is being said, being discussed as a staff, which I think is really great that they're opening up those conversations and creating that standard that it's okay to discuss things that may make you feel uncomfortable. One person says we may not know until we know, and that's why the conversations are so important. I think to finish it up, one person said it's the intent versus the impact. That your intent may be good, but you really need to think about the impact. How is it perceived by other people? Because that's more important than perhaps your intent. Your intent does not take you off the hook.
Thank you, Group 5. Again, the facilitators are doing a great job trying to boil it down into like a couple points. If you have more to add, please add it to the chat. I think they're capturing the essence, but if you want something else captured, please add that to the chat box. We're going to go to group number 6. If you had any additions to add, it was the same video as group 1.
6 already went, Jody, and you can go to 7.
7. Yeah. Celeste.
That would be us. We talked also about microaggressions. And one thing that we took away was that we need to be sure to learn about other cultures, be honest, be mindful, be intentional, but then also practicing humility as we recognize some of our own biases. We also talked about as we move forward, because we don't want to just identify this is my microaggression. What are we going to do to support our students and our families? And it's honestly recognizing our privilege regardless of what it is. Somebody, I forgot her name, I apologize, shared that it was that she had, oh, I know, Marjorie. She had recognized her privilege as an African-American female, and she's able to say things and do things that sometimes not others are able to say and do, and still recognizing that, but then also being brave enough to have courageous conversations with colleagues who might not understand why she can say or do what she does. The other thing that we also talked about was being prepared to have those courageous conversations with colleagues, more specifically in trying to understand the why. Not to say, how dare you say that? Did you know what you said was not appropriate? But why did you say that? What makes you think that it's okay? So instead of, if somebody says it, they didn't have that conversation in their head, and allowing them to have that conversation out loud and process it with you is also powerful. So those are the things that we talked about around microaggressions. And the fact that the analogy with a mosquito bite was amazing.
Thank you, all the facilitators. And we had co-facilitators that you don't see on the screen, but they help also. So we want to thank them for helping to process the information. So any other good for the order? Just make sure I captured all the groups. Okay, great. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So for those who are interested, again, you will have access to the links of these videos when we post it online, the MSA website. But we will probably revisit some of them again if you join us for part 2, because the dialogue is again about sharing resources and about processing through this. This is not easy work, it's complex work, and we have to realize we have to stay engaged and keep the conversation so we can move it forward. And then we can move into the action step. So to get us to where you take ownership, the first step is targeting your goals. We want you to start looking at this zone model that was created. It was a model created by an actual physician doctor, Andrew Ibrahim, but he used the ideas from it from the book from Dr. Ibrahim Candy, who we're going to be doing a book study on. And it's a way to talk about how do you move towards being anti-racist. Whether you find yourself in the fear zone or the learning zone or the growth zone, this is what his reflection kind of stated. So I want you to kind of look at that graphic and see what zone do you think you best fit in. And when you think about that, I wanted you to also process what move can you do to move from one zone to another. How will you serve as a resource for another who's trying to move from one zone to another? I take it that a lot of people in here are in the learning zone because you're here sitting past the webinar time to get this information. So kudos to you, and thank you for being so engaging in the conversation and letting us grow. So process that, and after the webinar ends, take a few minutes to kind of glance at that zone, identify which zone you belong and what actions you can take to move yourself to the next zone. So that's your homework for when we come back next time. To get you through that, I've created this 3-step process, and it's a way for us to kind of drive it. One of the things we want you to do is to utilize your agreements and compass, because we talked about how that's a great tool to understand not only where you are when you come into the conversation on race, where others are coming from in terms of what lens they're using. So start with that self-reflection, high impacts on you. I heard great dialogue about these videos shaping your mind and things that you didn't previously consider, decisions you were making in your classroom that you realize may have effect on some of the groups that we're talking about. So shift your mind, have the conversation with community members, because again, it is a real thing. There are some of the links that shared resources, the Harvard study to look at biases. We will share that link where you can access that. This is one of the works that MSCA did with First Book that you'll see. Grow yourself, learn more for your students, learn about microaggressions. We saw that some of the folks who mentioned how some simple statements, you speak very well, you don't sound black. Those are microaggressions, and it may sound like a compliment, but to those, it can be very harming. So educate yourself about racism, read books. Some people mentioned some new blogs that I didn't know about that I'm going to check out myself. Brush up on your history of racism so that you can understand and you can listen more and hear what your students of color, as well as your educators of color, are saying. You can be the voice for them. Decide what you do with the knowledge. Don't keep it within. Develop a network. The next stage is to advocate in action. Again, be that courageous voice. Be the voice for your students, their families, the community. Be that ally. Use reinforcement in your curriculum so that students see themselves. They see themselves in not stereotypical ways, but they see themselves in positive life. Have literature that you kind of reference to so they can see that positive narrative that we're talking about. Use communication tools. What I want to preface is some of the videos we showed you are great for adult audiences, some more for educators, some are more geared towards students. So be careful if you decide to show some of these videos, because they may not be developmentally appropriate for all age groups. So be mindful, but yes, use these for conversation starters, but mainly realize that everyone comes in this conversation and they have particular spheres of influence. They have spheres of influence that influence their shape, how they shape their mindset, how they behave, and how they interact with you. So ask yourself what messages you're sending your family members. So step 3, be that voice. Confront members of your family or friends or in your circle. If you hear a comment that is just not right, make a note to challenge that comment. It may be that they don't have a background information on why that comment may be troublesome or may not resonate well. So it may be something that you do on a separate conversation and not amongst the whole group. The purpose is not to win the argument, but the purpose is to start that conversation. Start that conversation. We must do it, and we must know how to enter the conversation so people feel safe and they feel that their voice will be heard. So again, in your journal, another thing we want you to do is to reflect on your leadership that you'll be providing and how you will be able to silence the face of racism. These three are resources that MSCA worked with First Book. You'll be able to access them through that link. And we can have somebody put that in the chat box for you so you can have access to that. This is an example of different books where students see themselves. There are non-stereotypical depictions. I want to preference, just because a book has diverse characters, please make sure that the storyline doesn't characterize them in a negative way. These two companies have been doing things way before the protest movement has occurred, so you may want to check them out. Embrace Race, and we need more diverse group books. So before you leave, I know we've kept you past time, but we need your feedback. So
almost done.
Link posted on the chat box. Please take the time to complete that feedback form, and then also determine your pathway to becoming anti-racist educator or anti-racist community members. We have different people with us today. Register for part 2. That link was shared earlier, but we'll post it again. And then join us in September for our book study. So the next session will be held on August 26th. The registration link is going to be posted also in the chat box. So save it on your calendar, August 26th. And also stay tuned. We'll be doing a book study of Dr. Ibram Kendi's book. And so details will be shared out in August. Book study will occur in September. So to be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. I thank you for joining us in this conversation so we can face this radical choice together as a community. At this time, we have posted our information where you can contact us. We want to thank you for joining us this evening, for being engaged learners, engaged in the discussion, for speaking your truth. We thank you for participating with this in all levels of that compass. So thank you. We'll wait to see if anything is populating in the chat box, and then we'll sign off shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well spent time.
Thank you. It's very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I see someone who's posed a question about the registration for August 26th. Beth, if you can post that again, that'd be great. And the feedback form, please do not exit without completing that feedback form. We'd love to hear from you so we can get ideas for our next webinar as well.
How do you get to that feedback form?
You won't be able to click on it from the chat box. You actually have to copy the link and take it to the browser.
No, you can click on it in the chat box.
You can click on it.
Sometimes it depends on, I've noticed that some people can't do it, but if you can't, that's another option. Depends what computer you're using. We're going to stop recording at this time, but I'm going to put the screen just so people can see the feedback again. If you had trouble finding that link, I'm going to put it back on the browser.